of the 2018 Amplify ELA webinar series. My name is Mike Peterson. I'm a proud member of the Amplify ELA team, and I'll be your facilitator today. In today's webinar, Empower Students to Become Critical Thinkers, we'll take a look at strategies for supporting and encouraging a culture of original thinking in your classroom. We have the privilege of being joined here with the founder of Amplify, Larry Berger, and Chief Academic Officer, Deb Sabin. Before I hand it over to them, we just need to go over a few housekeeping items. First, all questions can be asked using the GoToWebinar chat panel. You can enter your questions at any time during the presentation. And if we don't get to your question, we'll follow up via email after the webinar is finished. Also, there will be a few questions asked by the presenters. Please enter your responses in that same panel. Questions and answers you enter will only be seen by the presenters. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent to each of you by email 1 to 3 days after this live event. And for those who are unfamiliar with Amplify, we have been a pioneer in K-8 education since 2000. We provide core and supplemental programs for ELA, science, and math, and we are the program for teachers, providing them with the tools they need to help better understand and respond to the needs of all their students. Now our presenters. Larry Berger was a co-founder of the company nearly 20 years ago. Going back to the days when the BlackBerry was the hot new tech, he has led the invention of mobile software to help reading teachers as well as the next generation curriculum for elementary and middle schools. He serves on the boards of the Academy of American Poets, Latham's Quarterly, and the Institute of Sustained Attention. Deb Sabin leads Amplify's curriculum development teams for ELA. Previously, she was the Director of Instruction and Training for the Writers Express. She has been an ELA teacher in a variety of classrooms, from alternative high schools to elite prep schools to international dual language programs. Larry and Deb, thank you so much for being here today. I'll now hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. We are both very excited to be here, particularly to be here talking about middle school. Why does middle school matter? We feel pretty strongly that middle school is a unique age and really demands its own unique program and thought. Students are doing important developmental work. You can see that work happening in front of your eyes, and they need classroom experiences that really align to that development. They are more independent, but they're also pretty self-conscious. So they want to express their opinions, but they really need to be respected when they do express those opinions. They need additional challenge, but they are going to make many mistakes, and they need to be supported in understanding those mistakes and moving on from them. And for anyone who's been on social media lately, they are extremely invested in their peers, but they still need lots of guidance from adults, probably like many of the people that we have listening in this webinar. So thank you all for joining. And maybe most important, middle school represents the second biggest age of rapid brain development. It's the age where students are really developing their frontal cortex. That's the space that Marion Wolf refers to as the cognitive workspace. It's like the traffic control of thinking. So it is a use it or lose it period, in that if you are not working those neural pathways, they start to get pruned away. Maybe that's the reason that students who fail a middle school ELA class are more than 50% likely to drop out of high school. So for all those reasons, students need challenge. Students want to express their opinion. Students feel they want more independence and protect that. Perhaps particularly their brain development. We really want to talk today about creating a culture of critical thinking inside your classrooms.
Yeah, and I think the big idea that is, what is critical thinking for a middle schooler, really fundamentally, the thing we're trying to talk about today is not, are kids using their brain, are they thinking, but are you creating a culture in which kids are driving critical thinking in the classroom, where they understand the steps in the process, they're engaged in the steps of the process, they've written in ways that show they've thought critically, they're eager to share it, they're eager to hear each other's ideas. Because the real magic in middle school is not if you keep giving assignments that ask kids to think critically, but otherwise they go back to their normal routines, but rather they see this act of critical thinking as the big opportunity for them to sort of to think like adults, to have sophisticated ideas. And when you get that flywheel turning, when kids see that what happens in class is interesting because they're getting their ideas on the table, they're hearing their peers' ideas, and they're seeing how those work together to get to better ideas, then something magic starts to happen. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, there is this big question of like, well, what is critical thinking? At some level, if you're an ELA teacher, you're working with it all the time. But it's an interesting fact that we don't actually have a clear way of measuring critical thinking or not critical thinking. This became an interesting philosophical problem as computers started to be invented. And they started to do more complex tasks. People said, well, how would we know if the computer is thinking? How do we know it can do addition, it can do subtraction? We're pretty sure that's not thinking. How would we know if it is? And people worked on that a lot. And they started to say, well, we don't really know what this is. And the only solution they came up with is what we now call the Turing test. The gentleman on your screen is Alan Turing. He was a 20th century pioneer in code breaking and in computing. And he basically proposed the only way you would tell if someone is intelligent, or if it's a computer that's intelligent, is, and I don't mean intelligent smart, just literally can it think, is by putting it in a room with the door closed so you can't see and having a conversation with it, either by typing messages and seeing what replies come back, or and that if after communicating with it for a long time, you said, well, it seems like it's thinking, all of its responses feel like the responses a thinking human would make, then you conclude it's doing critical thinking. But that's kind of it. And what that leads to educationally is we have all of these standards in English language arts, each of which is pointing at a behavior that if you do it in context of complex thinking and complex conversation, that's a really good sign that you know how to do critical thinking. But on their own, each of them, if they're just on a worksheet and it's like, well, what's the author's perspective, circle 1 of 3, that might not mean that you're actually able to think critically about that. A computer could potentially do that and pass that Turing test. But having a rich conversation in which ideas are shared and new ideas are invented and evaluated critically, that's the thing that we know is critical thinking. But we know it because we feel it. There isn't like a clear test of here it is, here it isn't. So that's the challenge, but also the opportunity is how do you make it come to life in the classroom. So we have a little diagram that might be useful of these are the steps that seem like they are commonly at the heart of the critical thinking process. So the first step is that when you're applying this to text, but even other subjects, is that you make an observation. That there's something that you notice about that text, and that observation is activating. It causes you to have a burning question, something that you just that you need to know, like why is it that way? What is going on here? It doesn't have to be a sophisticated question. It's just something you care about. That is, I observed this. I don't know why it is that way. I want to understand it better. Once you have a burning question, you want to start considering alternative answers to that question. So what are the range of things that might be a way of responding to it? Notice that it's not just one answer, question and answer. That wouldn't require critical thinking. The word critical means I'm putting a bunch of ideas on the table and I'm choosing the one that seems like it's got the most evidence, it's got the most potential. So it's having multiple ideas. And that moment of the question generating alternative answers is the one where you are sort of constructing a cognitive workspace. You're saying, these are the things I would need to know and think about to be thinking critically. And of course, that is the step. Like now I have to critique or evaluate which of these alternative answers is the right one. And then I have to express it. I have to put my thoughts on the table in a way that others can hear and understand and evaluate. And when each of those things are happening, and ideally they're happening in a group where others are doing it too, and hearing each other's expression, that's when an exchange of ideas becomes really lively. And when kids realize that they can do each of these steps and they can listen for when their peers are doing each of these steps. That's the culture of student-driven critical thinking in the classroom. There's one other step that's just worth pointing out, that sometimes there's the matter of asking an alternate question. Some of the really great ideas are when everyone's asking the predictable question and someone says, is that really the question? Maybe there's another question that we should be considering that's right next to it, but might shed even more insight. So that's the process. Let's talk a little bit about how we get it going.
So I can kind of hear in my ear people out there saying it sounds pretty abstract and I'm just a new teacher, or I have lots of classes, and how do I get this going? And I would say that there are certain experiences and activities that support this type of thinking more than others. Thinking of debates, thinking of Socratic seminars. But even within those, the key experience, as you said, Larry, is this idea that the students are the ones that are exploring the text. The students are driving the meaning of the text. I would also say that the secret sauce of all of this is the orientation of you guys, the orientation of the teachers. So how do you create, as a teacher, that classroom culture where students are driving the meaning, where you're really trying to push that process that Larry went through? I think there are three things to think about. I think it's incredibly important to consider how you are facilitating discussions. So when a student expresses an observation or a question or an evaluation of a text, it's really important that the teacher express strong engagement in the student's ideas.
And I like that piece of teacher talk you have on the screen there, because it's not, I like the quality of your idea. It's, I'm interested in how you thought about it. Let's get on the table where your thought came from and how you got there.
Right, because the other thing you're trying to do is really get the kids to say more, develop their ideas, continue to go back to the text and think again and evaluate again. So that move of them being used to you saying, can you say more about that? Is there another way we could think about that? And then also you want to set them up to speak with each other. So when kids are working together around the text, or when they feel that part of what they are supposed to be doing and they enjoy doing with their peers is having peer-to-peer discussions, you're really, again, trying to facilitate those peer-to-peer discussions to be centered on the text. And that's the second thing that I would point out.
You know, actually, before I let you go to the next slide, I just want to point out that over and over again, Deb used the expression, and wait. And that moment of being tolerant of quiet, and I don't just mean by that wait time so that kids get you the right answer. It's like an enthusiasm for the fact that I'm giving you a chance to think about this. And so I've seen a lot of teachers who really celebrate that silence. Instead of saying, silence is the sound of kids not knowing the answer, they say, I love it when I hear your brains thinking. So and that's just also a way of extending the wait time. I can tell you guys are all really thinking about this.
Yes, and those of you who are worried about silence from an administrator's point of view, my husband's a middle school principal, and he came home raving about a moment, a minute, 2 minutes of silence in a classroom he observed, because he said it was so incredibly productive what came out of that silence, how the teacher had set it up, and then the observations that the students made after that silence kind of finally broke.
Exactly. So silence is the sound of thinking, not knowing.
But again, this idea of them having text-centered discussions where you are kind of outside of it and the text becomes the referee is something that will be unfamiliar to many students in middle school. And so you really have to kind of give them guidelines for those types of discussions. They can absolutely learn how to do this, but it's okay to spend a couple weeks really going through, almost in an awkward way, almost in a fairly rote way, how they are going to compare answers, go back to the text, really consider which answer is more correct and why. My sons both play ultimate frisbee, and one of the key tenets of ultimate frisbee is this idea that there is no referee, that the students have to be the arbiter of their own calls. And so it takes them a long time to learn that process, but they absolutely learn that process. And again, taking yourself out of the picture and putting the text in the center of the picture means that they are in control of the meaning of the text. And then the third thing that I really can't say enough about is the idea of putting writing into your classroom as a mode of critical thinking, as a place where they are actively making observations and evaluating those observations. Make it long enough that students have time to dig in but not get overwhelmed. And we've actually done some work on this and found that 10 to 12 minutes is about the amount of time when kids can both work critically with the text and stay focused on one idea. Because your role is to really challenge them to say more, but continue to keep them focused on that one idea.
And I think this idea of like start with the text, work with it early and often, one of the other big principles of a lot of good ELA lessons is that right at the beginning, kids are asked to react to something, to put something down on paper. And part of what happens there is they've committed to something. They've made one of those observations. They've maybe generated one of those burning questions, which once you have it, it starts to have a momentum of its own. But until you've actually had a quiet moment to write something, it's pretty easy, especially for a middle schooler, to be kind of looking out the window and therefore not have an observation or a burning question. When you have to write, suddenly, if there's something on the page, it might be the beginning of that thought process.
Yeah, and be confident that they do get to something interesting to say. They have a lot of interesting things to say when they are the ones that are making the observations about the text. So let's look at a piece of student writing and really think both about what the student is saying and what your role as a teacher is in terms of thinking about this writing moment as part of the way that you facilitate inquiry. So I'm going to move this off so I can read it. Here's a piece of writing that a student did, a 7th grade student did, in reaction to the story by Edgar Allan Poe, Telltale Heart, which we will talk more about today. And the student was asked, do you agree or disagree with the narrator's description of what's happening in the story? I'm going to give everyone a minute or two to read this piece of writing, because again, silence is incredibly productive, Larry. And think to yourself, both what's interesting to you about what the student is doing, and what kind of information would you like to give back to the student? So Mike is hanging on the response lines, eager to take your responses to what you see in this writing and how you might react to what the student is saying.
We'll give you a minute.
And for those who joined late, you can enter your responses in the chat panel, the GoToWebinar chat panel.
All right, Mike.
All right, we had just a few that come in. So a couple responses here. They said that they liked how the student made connections between what was read and the point he or she is making through quotes. And then also how the student applies what she knows about the real world to develop the response.
Yep. So it's a very different role for you as the teacher looking at the writing this way. I think we are used to, I know I was very used to, as a teacher of writing, being a provider of information at that moment where I'm giving feedback. Whoops. I'm starting to notice things like, has the student answered the question right up front? Are they staking a claim right away? I might start to point out as a provider of information where my student is making spelling mistakes, where my student is making grammatical mistakes, where my student is using or not using citation correctly, and on and on. But what if I then put on my hat of really thinking about, oh, I'm trying to facilitate this inquiry. How might I respond to the student in that moment? So I'm trying to pay attention to when the student digs into an idea. In that mode, I might pick out something like, because if they heard the sound, they would have probably looked around. On the other hand, since he says, I foamed, I raved, I swore, it is strange that the police don't even notice this. And if you know this moment in the story, there's a strange moment where he believes something is happening, but the policemen are acting as though nothing is happening. The student points out, it's a little strange, even so, that the police don't have any response to somebody foaming and raving and swearing around the room. So that's a moment where I'm pretty interested that he had that reaction, and I might give a little comment there. And I think, Mike, one of your commentators pointed out that moment in the end where they start to really, the student starts to really think about, maybe the reason he is hearing his heart beating louder as he's sitting with the policeman and the body is under the floor, maybe it's that he's hearing his own heartbeat. And maybe he's hearing his own heart because he's thinking about killing the man. So now my student has moved from just answering that idea of do you agree or disagree with the narrator's description of what is happening to beginning to evaluate their own observation about, no, I don't really agree. On the other hand, it seems like he does really hear it. And now they're starting to kind of come up with questions and answers and possible solutions. So again, just as that first slide, my role is to really express engagement with that idea.
Exactly. And I think one of the things is, as a teacher going through it the first time when it's one of 100 things you have to grade, it's so much easier to see would have probably as a mistake that you should help and correct. It's actually quite hard when you're sort of numbed by the number of things you've read to realize, wait, there are two pretty original ideas. Like, he's not just restating what's in the story. He's got a theory of the policeman's behavior. He's got a theory of really the origin of the telltale heart. Whose heart is it really? Those are great ideas. They are original. They're signs of critical thinking. And the moment when you notice it and you say, I'm interested in this, tell me more about it, say more about the evidence for how you got here, those are kind of electric in terms of getting the critical thinking flywheel turning. The moment they've done that work, they're interested in hearing what you have to say, and instead you correct their grammar. It's not that we're against correcting grammar, it's just don't miss the ideas when they happen. They're rare enough that when they get there, it's important to see them even through some of the mistakes of convention.
Yeah, because what I would say, again, this is not a polished piece of writing. Your students are still going to be doing those polished pieces of writing. But when they start to realize they have something interesting to say and that their teacher or their peers are actually interested in what they have to say, then they become much more invested in correcting their grammar, in understanding how to spell suspicious correctly. So becoming a facilitator of inquiry, really thinking about putting the text at the center and allowing students to have discussions around the text even without you, and then really integrating writing into your classroom, into much of the reading that you're doing, and this type of focused writing, I think, are three things to really think about. But how overall then do you structure a close reading to challenge and support critical thinking? So that's the next thing that we're going to talk about. So since the student had written about Telltale Heart, we're going to start with Telltale Heart for a few reasons. It is the month of October. He is a spooky writer. He is a writer that's covered in many middle school classrooms, and he is also a writer whose stuff is fully available. In fact, it's public domain. So it's accessible to anyone who wants to use it. You don't need a license. It is also a piece of writing, Telltale Heart, that just invites the reader to begin to ask questions. You have a very strange narrator who immediately begins addressing somebody with this strange tale. And so quickly, as a critical reader, you begin to ask these questions. Who is this guy? What is the story he's telling me? What do I think of this story? And you start to consider all the alternate possibilities for what he's saying. Now, many middle school students do not have the language, the literary language that's applied to the story, which is the language of unreliable narration. So for many of us, when we first teach the story, we think, okay, the thing that I need to do is to begin by telling my students what is an unreliable narrator. They don't have that information. I need to give them that information. Maybe it becomes a reading strategy for them. Then, now we're ready to read Poe together as a class, and now we're going to answer questions about why this narrator is unreliable.
It sounds good. It's the information you need to have. You could write unreliable narrator up on the whiteboard, but of course the risk is now the kids don't have to do any thinking. You've told them what's at stake in this story. And so an alternative view is that you don't start there. You start with the text, so not with introducing the concept of an unreliable narrator, but just read the book. Let the book do the work. Let it have the effect. And now have observations that the students make. Why is the narrator acting this way? Why do you think he thinks it's okay to kill the old man? Why do you think he thinks? And not even the why, but just literally what? Where is he? What's going on? What? And very simple sort of DOK1 questions are perfectly adequate to get kids building a model of what happens. And it is always the moment, if you do this with sort of any commitment to just letting the mystery hang there in the air, where some kid says, why does he still hear the heart beating? It just said in the last paragraph, his heart stopped beating. And that's the moment when kids start to find their own way to, this is an unreliable narrator. They might not have that language yet, but then they've discovered the concept. The elementary school narrator is someone you can trust. The middle school narrator, like most of great literature, is someone you have to wonder about.
So now I'm going to tell you a secret move that a teacher told me who was teaching a very high level text to very high level students late in August. It's a text that's very, very tough to deconstruct. And these were students that were used to knowing all the answers. So they would come into class on the first day and they would just rail against the text. I don't know anything. I don't know what is this text? I can't figure out anything. And he would just say, just tell me one thing you do know. It can be a tiny little thing. Just begin with something you do know. So that's where we're going to begin with Poe, because it is a tough text for many students. So we're going to start with just the first sentence of Telltale Heart.
And I think the task we'd love to try is to get all of you to just put 2 or 3 things that you feel you're being told in this sentence. So we're not asking you yet, what does the story mean? We're just saying, what do you think you're being told in this opening sentence? And would love to leave 30 seconds of silence,
golden silence,
to let you do this.
And I gave you an example, which is best, that a student might just simply say there's an I in this sentence and there's a you in this sentence.
So the first response I received is, or we received is, he is just nervous, or he is crazy.
Okay, he's nervous.
That's great. It's right there.
The narrator is speaking to another person.
The narrator is speaking to another person. So as a facilitative inquiry, what might you ask that student, Larry?
Who's that other person?
What do you know about that?
Where do you think the 2 of them are?
Can anyone tell me anything about that other person, just based on this sentence?
Well, we had someone that actually said he's speaking to us,
and
we think he is crazy.
So you figured out that whoever the you is, perhaps it's us, one of the things you do know about them is they think that this person is crazy.
So these are great, and I think one of the things we would do is in a classroom leave a lot of time for that stuff to surface, and it's also perfectly fine as the teacher, after folks have done things, to offer up 1 or 2 things that you observed that they might not have the tool set to do. So one of the ones that I sometimes find myself talking about is the fact that the opening word of the story is true with an exclamation point. implies something was just said right before that. What's that thing that was said right before that? Kids can, what's the thing that's true that he seems to be responding? It's also potentially interesting that whenever somebody asserts really hard that something is true, in all caps in this case, you might have an immediate reflex that is, wait, why does he feel he needs to tell me that it's true? Maybe there's something that's not true, and you start to have some doubt. The thing that gets at sort of a kind of sophisticated level of close reading, you might talk about the strange number of times that are nervous. Very, very nervous I had been, something in the past, and am, but why will you say that I'm mad? All said in response to something that someone said just a moment ago. So lots of different time frames and registers in one sentence. Potentially the work of a narrator whose sense of where he is and what just happened and how the events connect is dubious. So those are all examples of like things that you could get to just by asking, what are you being told in this sentence?
Yeah, just by getting those observations going and working with them. Hopefully people can see that just by observing this narrator, it gets ready to ask some interesting questions. So let's keep tracking the narrator. Things become quite interesting in this story if you read it as the story continues. The narrator ends up committing a murder. Most of the story is spent telling you how and why he commits this murder, and then how he covers it up. Towards the end of the story, as a reader, you really start to see that certain things that he's describing may not be, in fact, what is taking place. So that's where you really want your students to be using their cognitive workspace, to be driving their observations. So give them an activity or a space to do this in. In the Amplified curriculum, we have an app that allows the students to begin storyboarding these scenes at the end, but we used to do it just on paper, having students create comic book versions of the end of the story. So first, because it's less complex, we just ask the students to, again, work with your observations. What do you notice going on in the text? How would you represent that? So go to the text, keep going back and forth to the text, evaluate what the narrator is doing, and put that down on paper. Once they do that, they then can go back and do the trickier work of beginning to think through, well, what do I think is happening? So that's where all those questions come up. Well, the narrator says that he hears a heartbeat, but I'm noticing those policemen are just sitting there and not responding to what he's hearing. So maybe they don't hear a heartbeat. But they do see this guy getting up and kind of roaming around the room in some fairly disturbing ways. So at that point, they are probably wondering something's happening, but still they're not hearing the heartbeat that he's hearing. And then in the end, when the narrator finally confesses and collapses on the floor and yells at the policeman to tear up the floorboards and find the body that he's dismembered and buried underneath, that's just a little Halloween moment for all of us. Probably at that point, the police figure out that a crime has been committed. But at that point, you've now kind of given them that workspace to track those observations. Their observations about the narrator, and then their observations about themselves as a reader and how they're reading this. And done correctly, you can then put those two perspectives back together for them. Now you've put them again in that moment where the text becomes a referee, either with pairs or peers or even individually. They can start seeing, okay, what actually was my understanding of that text? And how did that compare to the narrators? And then you, as the teacher, are in a great position to be the facilitator of inquiry, to do all those things that we talked about on those early slides, to kind of be engaged at those moments where they see a difference between the narrator's perspective and the reader's perspective.
And a key thing about this thing that we've just shown, and again, this is an app in the curriculum, but everything that we're talking about today, we've designed to say you could do this with or without these tools. But the key thing about this exercise is it's not just illustrate what's happening here, sort of your take on it, but it's really close read each sentence and ask, where are the characters? Where is the body? Where are the police? But then not just like physically what's the layout, but what are people thinking? We provide the thought bubble, so you can ask, what are these people thinking? What's the main character thinking? And also, what are the sounds? What kind of noise is being made in each of these? And of course, part of what kids realize is in the narrator's version, there is a loud heart beating. In the reader's version, maybe there's not. And that moment is the moment where they realize, so there's two different stories, or maybe I don't trust the narrator. But when kids get to that, when they arrive there through a bunch of work that they've done, through a cognitive workspace that they've built, through a back and forth with their peers, each of whom made a slightly different storyboard of this, then they've discovered something that's exciting to them. If you start the lesson saying, today we're going to learn about unreliable narrators, look how different what the narrator says and what you as a reader think is in the Telltale Heart, then you've taken the life out of it and no one has to do any thinking at all.
Yeah, and it may be absolutely important that they get this term unreliable narration, and then this is the moment, you as the provider of information, you can give that, you can talk about how that's illustrated in their storyboards, but you may also have a class, and I'm glad you said maybe they think that the heart is not beating,
yeah,
where you've opened up a range of interpretations, and I have certainly seen students go to the floorboard, so to speak, defending the idea that that heart is beating under the floorboards.
Yeah.
And of course, Poe would say that that's the experience that he wanted his readers to have. But again, if your job is to really show them those moments of disconnect, you've set up a situation where you can pair them up to really go back to the text, and they have to come to an agreement. You think the heart's still beating? I think the heart's not. Let's go back to the text, and we have to decide what the evidence of the text shows us.
Yeah, the text as referee.
Yeah. So, questions. Mike, we have finished the end of our close read of Telltale Heart. We'd love to hear questions.
Let's take time to answer. We had one question come in. Again, audience members, I encourage you to just type your questions in the chat panel, and we'll answer more questions at the end of the presentation. But here's the first question. How do I implement these things or strategies with struggling students?
So similarly to what we showed in the beginning, I think you have to start with very small chunks of text. So you're not trying to dumb down the text, but you're trying to give them a small cognitive workspace, so to speak. So again, you start small, and you have already curated the text, so you know that where is the rich area of exploration. So again, circling the pronouns, for example, having the kids just asking them, sequencing an observation like that. Circle the pronouns in this first sentence. What do you notice? What does that tell you? So it does involve a lot of curation on your part, but again, the movement becomes one of facilitating inquiry. And I would say in doing a couple of years of work with the school district outside of Chicago, when teachers began to make this flip to really facilitating inquiry and having the students drive the exploration of the text, they were very worried about the reaction of their struggling students in particular. And what they found, in fact, was that those students felt that the playing field had been more leveled because there wasn't a lot of things that they were expected to come in with preloaded, or there wasn't a need to immediately jump to a big question. How is this narrator unreliable? There was a sense with close reading and with this type of process that they were all going to move through it together.
And that's, I think, a really important part of this is that the steps, observing something, having a question, listening to what others say, each of those on its own, struggling students can do. If you take the activity and you make the text short enough that the language isn't the barrier, because you can literally work through each part of the language, and you might have to do a step of acting it out, of storyboarding it, of drawing, of clarifying vocabulary. But at a certain point, you're through the language. And the great thing about ELA is, unlike science, for example, where you might not have a whole bunch of precursor knowledge that you need to be able to talk about this, this story is about a policeman, a murderer, a crime scene.
A guy with a strange eye, don't forget.
Yeah, there's a guy with a strange eye. But like, everyone gets these things, and they get the idea that a murderer might feel guilty. So the the hard part is getting the language to work for kids who might struggle with it. But once it's about the human nature that's at stake here, once it's about the character, then there's very often a quite level playing field where everyone can actually formulate their opinion about what has actually happened here.
I will say that one thing that these teachers outside Chicago noticed was they had to really know the text, because as much as they were worried about this flip, when it happened, they said students started coming into class and saying, oh my gosh, I have such a great question, or did you notice this, or wasn't this just like this? And so they said, you know, it was very exciting to them, and it really created this sense that the students were now in control of what was happening with the text. So these types of things can drive your reading. We hope they have kids go on to read more and more Poe, but because this is a special day, we are going to offer listeners a special experience, because we actually have put together a quest that involves Poe and that really does its extrinsic motivation for reading more Poe. So Larry's going to talk to you about that, but it also involves critical thinking.
All right.
So, Mike, did you have another question?
Well, we just had someone else chime in. You may have just covered it, but the perspective of a ESL higher education professor, would you suggest basically the same strategies, or maybe something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think for ESL students, again, shortening the text, some of the things that Larry talked about, acting it out, adding visual aids, but you know, so much of what you're trying to do with English language learners is get them to produce language. So the less you say and the more spaces for them to say. And again, the sense of you're going to make a really wrong observation sometimes, and that's okay, because it's a cycle where you then go and look again and think again and collaboratively work with your peers to build up observations and come to some collaborative understanding. So I would say that it is especially applicable in that way to ESL classes, because it allows such a premium priority placed on conversation and language production.
So the thing we're going to show now is something we call a quest, and this is again, this is part of Amplify, but for today and for people who are watching this, we're going to make it available for all of you to use, because this is something that you could try to do at home, but it took a lot of work to develop it, and it was a big team of people working creatively over a long period of time to make it happen and then to make it really work. And the big idea here is individual lesson plans can be good, sequences of lesson plans to help bring a text to life, lots of people do well. The challenge of like, how do you get kids to believe that each thing they're learning is building towards some culminating level of activity requires a lot of design. And one of the things that we tried to do with a few of our units every grade is to have a kind of culminating activity, what we call a quest, where kids start to feel, I better actually get my head around each of the things I'm supposed to learn in this unit, because I might have to perform a role or have a task or solve a problem in this thing called a quest that's coming. So in this one, because it's Poe, the way it begins is Edgar Allan Poe has been murdered by one of his characters or one of his rival authors, and he's dead on the floor. There's all kinds of clues pointing in different directions, and the question is, who did it? And everyone in the class is both a detective and also plays one of the characters. So like in many of these murder mysteries, there's a complex house, there's different things that happen in different rooms, there's a narrative that unfolds, and you as the detective are trying to figure out who did it, in what room, and what was their weapon, and what were their motives. And you're given a lot of different things to Baltimore City Police report on this, which of course incriminates all of the Poe characters. So there's raven feathers, and there's perfume, and there's there's floorboards that have been messed with, and then there are a bunch of questions that guide you through it, and of course each one of them further incriminates each of the characters. And you're of course having the experience of being the detective trying to make sense of all this, but also being one of the characters trying to cover up and maybe make everyone realize that you're not actually guilty. And you are actually interrogating the characters. Where were you on the night that Poe died? You interview them all, you gather your table of evidence. And then as the quest gets to the end, you're actually going to make a bunch of interpretations of it, and then you're going to make an accusation. So I believe that so-and-so did it in this room at this time for these motives. This is who their accomplices were. And kids get very dramatic because they have reasoned all the way through this, and they have to convince the jury of their correctness. And what we love about this quest is that process of solving a murder mystery is following every one of those steps in the critical thinking process. You're observing things, you're developing burning questions about why was it that way, you're developing alternate theories, you're gathering the evidence to figure out which one it is, and then you're having to express it. You have to argue it before a jury of your peers. The exciting thing about doing this in the context of Poe is at the beginning of a unit of reading Poe, almost every middle school kid will say, I don't know how to find my way through this 19th century eloquence. It's not something I can read. When they have success in a shared classroom experience of reading, say the Telltale Heart, and then maybe we move them up to an even more challenging text or poem, and then at a certain point we break for the quest, and suddenly they're using everything they've learned from a few of those texts, but they're also meeting characters like the Red Death that they didn't actually read about in class. And you'll be happy to know that their detective notebook includes the poems and stories that they might not have read in class. And what we see is lots of kids, because they're hooked on this culture of, I gotta read this stuff, I gotta write this stuff because I have a chance to show it off in class and solve this problem. We see this flurry of kids reading these Poe stories that they weren't assigned, reading these Poe poems that they weren't assigned, all because there's a big problem they have to solve, and there's a classroom culture that grows up over several days of, we're going to have all the evidence to solve this. And they see how valuable it is that they've read the Telltale Heart, so they know about the floorboards. But there's a bunch of details about this woman, Annabelle Lee, that they don't understand because we didn't read that. But luckily, there's a whole poem about her in the back of the book. And so you get intrinsic motivation of reading to solve this extrinsic puzzle that is whodunit in this case.
Yeah, so it's incredibly fun, it's very immersive, it's very involved, it's long, but I'd like to pull back and just remind us of where we started, which was just that first sentence.
Yeah.
So I think part of thinking about critical thinking, thinking about thinking, is this idea that you started off with, that it's a culture. It's a cultural shift that takes place in classrooms. And it really involves, in large and small ways, creating moments that support a range of interpretations, because kids need to see on the table the range of interpretations and how you or your peer or a group of you might go back to the text and think about what the text is saying and how to evaluate those. Again, it's a culture where kids are talking to each other, and you're not removed from that conversation, but you're facilitating that conversation around the text. And then again, your role is, it's hard to emphasize how valuable it is to show them that they have something interesting to say. Again, in small ways, but I would say particularly in terms of integrating those focused writing moments into a lot of your close readings. Do you want to talk about the teacher being the most important ingredient, Larry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the point that Deb just made, that that in some sense we're saying the classroom could develop momentum around this on its own, and it's true that you can get some of that going, but it's almost always, in our experience at middle school, because the teachers set a bunch of wheels in motion, and the teachers created a culture in which thinking is celebrated, which means silence is celebrated. Texts are chosen to get kids to have burning questions, a culture of there isn't really a right answer in the room, but we are really interested in the evidence that argues for one answer or another. And as the facilitator of this conversation, you're as a teacher, you're not the one who shows, here's how to have sophisticated thoughts about Poe that I seem to know how to do, sure wish you guys knew how to do it, but you're celebrating all the ideas that they have, and you're saying, when someone has an idea that sounds like it could be right or could be wrong, how do we use the text as the referee? You're constantly showing them that habit of going back and arguing it from the text. And then, it's also being engaged with students' ideas and challenging them. I find that one of the hardest things to do when you're teaching a difficult text is you've been wanting them to have a certain insight, and then someone finally has it, and you're like, yes, Irene, that was right, thank you. The thing that's really interesting at that moment, because usually the class kind of has a sense that someone just figured it out, is to say, really? What possibly makes you think that? So that people realize that your response may just be all about motivating thinking, and then Irene, who thought she had it figured out, has to defend it. And then when you say, exactly, that's terrific, I just pushed you to make sure you'd really thought it through, it just creates you as a kind of unpredictable agent of, no matter how right or wrong or promising or not promising what someone said is, you're going to be there pushing more thinking. Not right or wrong thinking, but just more.
Yeah. A couple years ago, I was in a class and the teacher was teaching a poem and teaching it largely in this way. And at the end of the class, the student came up and he said, Miss So-and-so, my brain really hurts and I really like it.
That's the feeling we're trying to get. So this PoeQuest, we said we would make it available for you. It's a really fun thing. We urge you to try it, and we would welcome your feedback. It's at amplify.com/Poe, P-O-E, and we recommend it for the week of Halloween. It usually takes about 4 or 5 days to get through it, sometimes a little bit longer, and it tends to always be a hit. So we'll pause there. We'll have lots of wait time and hope that folks have some questions that they want to send our way.
That get us to think critically.
All right, thanks, Larry and Deb. I also did share the web address in the chat panel, so our audience members just can click on that link to sign up for the free quest. So a few questions. Again, if we don't get to your questions, we'll answer them via email after the webinar. First question, what types of questions do you suggest to use for nonfiction texts? Would you use something different for social studies?
So, I mean, one of the big differences, it is sometimes, except in the great primary texts, less interesting in nonfiction to ask, I wonder why that choice of language. It's not that it's not interesting. In poetry and literature, it's always at stake. In informational text, sometimes it's just what's the piece of information they're trying to convey. And I think in some sense the principles that we talked about remain unchanged. You're trying to get kids to observe something. You're trying to get them to have a burning question about history or the social issue that's at stake. You're trying to get them to develop different theories. The theories might not be what's going on in this text. It might be what happened in the French Revolution, but they're trying to put a few theories on the table and then get to the text, but also to each other's judgment as sources of evidence about what's right and or what's best in the arguments that they're considering. So I would say the subject matter changes. There's maybe a little bit less attention to form and sort of the devices of language, but to the extent that social studies and history also means reading the Pericles funeral oration or reading the Gettysburg Address, all that attention to language is suddenly invited in the great texts of the history and social studies tradition.
Yeah, and I've seen teachers lead a class around a science text and really focus on a section of a scientific text that may describe a process, a particularly complex process, and do this exact same storyboarding with students around that process, and then ask questions about, well, what happened if this factor changes? How would that impact what you're seeing or how you've storyboarded this? So again, that idea of curating the text before the close reading and understanding where those moments of productive questioning and productive observations happen.
And I would also say that history and social studies classes really lend themselves to that idea of you develop bodies of knowledge and familiarity with it, and then put them to work in some sort of social simulation, like what we did with the PoeQuest, where you are the Roman Senate debating something, and kids have roles, and they've prepared for them. That notion that the things I'm learning are useful in some subsequent activity can be a hard thing to establish in history and social studies, But when you can get it going, not just in the form of the Senate used to argue then, and it sure enough is arguing now, that's a little bit interesting, and an observation always worth making. But sort of what was at stake in that original context?
Mm-hmm.
What were people really thinking and feeling then?
Yeah, and then I would say particularly primary documents, something that we didn't talk about today, but is often a way for kids to work together, again, with this text as referee, is when you have a complex document like the Declaration of Independence, having them paraphrase a particularly juicy sentence when they have to really try and restate it as closely as possible in their own words, but sticking super close to the original syntax or the original meaning, and then compare their paraphrases. That opens up that moment of evaluation and critique and refinement.
Thank you. Do you explicitly teach students the steps in critical thinking as you outline them to us?
I think it's fine to do it. I think it's fine to not do it. I would experiment with it. We definitely
push kids to select something from the text, to prioritize something over something else. So like make an observation and then be able to describe and explain why you made that observation. So to begin that process of why did I pick this and why is it interesting? So I think in that sense, we put them through that sequence somewhat explicitly, but we do not explicitly teach them that language. But it'd be interesting to think about.
We should try it. I think we should make them all watch this webinar.
All right, and then if we do nothing else, what's the one thing we should do in our class to get students thinking critically?
So I would say integrate writing, but I'm not the, I actually think it is this really trying to flip to thinking of yourself as that facilitator of inquiry, the person who expresses engagement, who challenges and pushes students questioning, who asks them to, can you say more about that?
Is just feedback on their writing. Like when there is an idea in their writing that is a sign of critical thinking, that you're there admiring it, not admiring the rightness or the wrongness of it, but of the thought process that led to it, and pushing them to tell you more about how they got there. I think of all the things we see that get kids certainly writing more in this context, it's when the teacher takes an interest in their ideas, and then if that is compounded by teacher, after they've developed their idea a little bit better, encourages them to share that idea, and then the class is interested in that idea, not because middle schoolers are by default interested in their peers' ideas. They are, but they aren't always so good at showing it, but because you've actually taught the routines of what I really like about what Deb just shared was, but the one question I have is, when kids know how to do that so that their ideas are on the table and are motivating kid responses, that's when the flywheel starts turning.
All right, that looks like all the questions that we have today. I just want to remind people that you will receive the recording through email 1 to 3 business days after this live event. And also, if you'd like to learn more about Amplify, visit our website at amplify.com. But other than that, Deb and Larry, thank you so much for this presentation, and I want to thank all the audience members for joining us today. But I'll let you go and Deb and Larry to do the final sign-off. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It's always a little strange doing these webinars because we can't see all of you out there, but I imagine you all as incredibly invested middle school teachers ready to kind of rush back into your classroom and do the good work that you're doing every day.
And please, we put forward a few ideas about what gets critical thinking going, but as we said in this session, the exchange of ideas is where the powerful stuff happens. So if anyone out there in webinar land has some stuff they've tried with kids that seems to work for them, would love to hear your ideas and try them out ourselves. So look forward to hearing from you on this topic, and do hope you try that Edgar Allan Poe quest and let us know what you think of it.
Yeah, read more.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.